Okay. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us for the seminar part of the HTI initiative at SAIS, the seminar series. Tonight, we are hosting, well, very well-known experts in the field that is the object of the discussion tonight, and also representative of institutions that are partner of SAIS as they host students during summer internships and during different projects that SAIS participates in. So it is a double pleasure. I will just take a few seconds to introduce the speakers to you. And again, then I'm going to leave the floor to Alexandra Malangone. I'm going to start from her just because she's my partner in crime in the coordination of the Human Trafficking Initiative at SAIS. It is a project that has now been going on for several years. It has started during COVID, and it has been very successful over the years. It is now evolving. So we are working on our next phase. We are facing challenges that we shall overcome. So we will come back in new versions, new forms. But again, tonight, I am particularly proud to announce that we've been able to put together this very important panel. So thank you to all the speakers for joining us. Alexandra, some of you may know, is a lawyer with a background in criminal law, but mostly she is a great expert from the field in actions against human trafficking. She has been a member of numerous UN and European bodies that address these issues. She is the co-coordinator of the Human Trafficking Initiative, and I have to thank her for all the great work that she does for this project. And I know that some of you know her because you've been working with the HDI at SAIS. Alexandra will be coordinating this discussion based on two presentations, one by Professor Sorcha MacLeod, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Copenhagen. Her expertise is specifically on businesses, human rights and security, and especially human rights impact and regulation of mercenaries and private military and security companies. She is also, and we cannot not mention that, she's also a former member of the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries. So she actually has a very fresh perspective on this phenomenon. And I am very grateful that she took the time to come here. So thank you very much, Professor MacLeod, for being here. Then we have General Giuseppe de Magistris, Brigadier General Giuseppe de Magistris, the director of the Center of Excellence for Stability Police Units, which is based in Vicenza. Prior to this appointment, of course, he held numerous offices that I'm not going to list all, but he has a wide field experience. So if after the conference you want to stop by and ask him questions, please feel free to do that because he has a lot of stories to tell. So feel free to inquire about his past experiences. I am not going to steal more time. I just want to reiterate how crucial the theme of mercenaries is in the context of human trafficking. It will not surprise you, of course, that mercenaries are directly connected to SDG, especially the SDG on justice and peace, and especially to children. So it goes without saying that normally one would link this topic to this specific group of people. However, I want you to keep an open mind, as I think tonight we will be enlightened about different aspects that might put in connections human trafficking and mercenaries in a wider and probably less expected perspective. So thank you again for being here, to those that are physically here and to those that are online. I'm going to leave the floor to Alexandra, and thank you again to all of you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you all again for being here, numerous in presence and also online. Many of you, I think most of you by now know the format of our series. It's usually We have two guests, so one guest moderated discussion. So of course, at the end, there will be Q&A session. We'll be having questions in person, hopefully, and also by those who follow us online. I would like to again thank Professor Sorcha MacLeod to be here. I'm very grateful to Michal Gromek, who you have met some of you in the past, and Dr. Alexandra who were here also at the HDI series last year, who had introduced Sorcha to me. And of course, my great thanks go to Generale de Magistris for finding the time in his busy schedule and actually accepting the invitation to be a co-speaker together with Dr. MacLeod, giving his experience, his expertise, and specifically talking about the synergies between the work that Dr. Sorcha MacLeod is doing and he is doing in terms of the stability policing. So again, thank you so much. Sorcha, before I give you the floor, I wanted to go a little bit less formal. And I read something, of course, online about the way you were working in your career as a researcher, and you were invited to join different projects. But there was a particular moment where you joined the project on the regulation of private military and security companies. And that was a turning point in your career, because you have been dedicating, all your years to this niche. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us more a little bit about what was in particular that lit the spark for you in this topic at the time.
People caught me off guard with that, Alex. I think the what you're talking about is the Privwar project,
That's right.
which was when I was a young academic. I was invited by senior professor. I was at the University of Sheffield at that time, and I was working on business and human rights more generally from a PhD, and they wanted somebody who knew about human rights to come on board with that project, and yes, you say what lit the spark. I think the topic sort of got its claws into me and never let go. It seemed to me that this was an area that was of great relevance, and I'd always been interested in the intersection between natural resource exploitation and human rights, and a lot of the human rights violations that were taking place in the natural resource sector. And that's what I worked on when I did my LLM. It was those violations were committed by security type actors, whether public security or private security, or somewhere in between.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and I'm glad that you mentioned of course, the business and human rights nexus and the link. You may know that, of course, HDI initiative has hosted numerous speakers discussing the nexus between business and human rights. Just before Christmas, we hosted Dr. Yanis Tinius from Finland, who leads impressive work of business in fostering ethical recruitment in the Nordic countries. Today, we will be speaking a little bit also about unethical recruitment, so we'll be really creating some continuation here. And you in particular also remember facing the security sector's disinterest and resistance, the business and human rights agenda as such. And then a shift happened, right? And a few years after, there was the creation of the Montreux document in 2008 and the ECOCA in 2013. And you were an original contributor to these frameworks and these changes. So could you tell us a little bit more, and then you go into in presenting your work about what was the work behind the scenes to foster this change?
Well, I think what had happened was that there had been the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, and suddenly there was a lot of attention started to be focused on the private military and security companies that were being used by the US, by the UK, and by other European countries, because there had been a shrinking in the armed forces in many of those countries, and they simply didn't have the capacity to deal with everything that they were dealing with in those conflicts. And you know, it sort of took the debate into a new direction, because what we were seeing was an outsourcing of the use of force to the private sector in a way that had not really taken place before. We'd seen it to a certain extent in the Balkans in the 90s, but that hadn't got a huge amount of attention. Although the DynCorp case, which of course was a case of human trafficking, had got attention. But it was Iraq and Afghanistan that really started focusing attention on these actors, and countries took the view. The countries that were outsourcing the use of force to these actors took the view that, well, they're not mercenaries. We're not using them to fight. They're not providing combat services, and that was the sort of difference. You know, there was this very clear attempt to separate them from you know the mercenary word or description, but at the same time it was recognised that these actors were operating in a complete regulatory vacuum, and states were not willing to necessarily regulate at the national level, and so we saw the Swiss initiative being established by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Swiss government, which led ultimately to the Montreux document on private military and security companies, which now has 59 states that adhere to it, and those states agree to implement domestic law that will regulate private military and security companies. And then the International Code of Conduct Association for Private Security Providers emerged a few years later on the back of that, which was directed to the security companies themselves. Mm-hmm. And it introduces standards for them in terms of their corporate structures, but also in terms of how they comply with human rights. And of course, human trafficking is one of the human rights standards that they're expected to adhere to. And so, actually, in my slides, maybe actually let me just go forward to them. Go to it now. Maybe I should have put this up first, but this is to really illustrate that we're talking about a spectrum of actors. Anyone who's heard me speak before, I apologise for this. I regularly talk about the spectrum of actors, and they all exist on a security spectrum, and they all exist in some way outside of state security system. There are, of course, clear overlaps with some, but on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got your kind of standard security actors that many of us see on a daily basis. We might see them at shopping malls. We might see them on public transport, all the way through to actors that are providing security services in situations of armed conflict, but are not providing combat services. All the way to the far right of the screen, where we have armed conflicts, both national, international and non-international armed conflicts. And we have actors who are literally providing fighting services. They are providing combat services. And in some circumstances, they will fall under the international legal definition of mercenary. Now, states are very much in disagreement about where the mercenary line begins and ends. You will have many states that will say states should never outsource the use of force to the private sector, and that all such actors are mercenaries. And other states will say no, they exist and they are different. We'll talk about the definition as I go into my presentation, but it's important to understand that there's very little agreement about what a mercenary is. Or what a private military security company is or isn't. Mercenary is defined under international law and regional law, but it is not. It is a private military security company is not defined under international law. Neither is private military company, private security provider, private security company. These are all names that really don't mean anything. It's actually more important to think about what these actors are doing, the services that they provide. So. Okay, so if I go back to let me go back. Caught me off guard again. No, people don't generally catch me off guard. She's good.
We'll teach you some boxing skills.
Absolutely. So
I like teaching boxing skills.
take those lessons, thank you. So Alex and Alex asked me back in September last year if I would come and talk to you about mercenaries, and we spoke a couple of months ago. I was like, what exactly would you like me to talk about when I talk about mercenaries? And it came, it's pretty much everything. Like, right, let me see if I can somehow weave this together in a way that will make sense. And what I've decided to do is to try and focus on the sort of 4 key elements that we'll see when we look at the definition of mercenary and some of the international legislation around mercenaries. And I want to focus on the use of mercenaries, the training of mercenaries, the recruitment of mercenaries, the financing of mercenaries, and then ultimately to talk about the accountability or the lack of accountability for human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law committed by mercenaries. So that in essence is what I'm going to try and weave together today for you. Now, we've already started talking about the links with human trafficking. And I think you can see those links most clearly when it comes to the recruitment of mercenaries and when it comes to the financing of mercenaries. Very simply, what we see is that the way in which mercenaries are being recruited in this point in the 21st century is very different from how it used to be. And we are moving away from the idea of mercenaries as these kinds of people, highly militarized, probably ex-military, probably in some circumstances ex-police, sometimes ex-criminals. We're seeing people who are being recruited in a way that means that they are being predated upon, that there's predatory recruitment going on, and that they are being trafficked for the purposes of mercenarism. So the recruitment processes link very much with human trafficking. And when it comes to the financing of mercenarism, we'll talk about both of these things in more detail as I go through the presentation. But the financing of mercenarism also intersects with human trafficking, because what we're seeing with the financing of mercenarism is that the financing ecosystems that mercenaries are using, both the hiring, the payment of individual mercenaries, etc., they're using the same financial ecosystems as are used by human traffickers, by transnational organized crime and others. They're very much the same, but at the same time, they are absent from the conversation around illicit financial flows. So what I wanted to start off by saying was that contemporary mercenarism has increased exponentially in the last few years. Mercenaries have been around a long time. You'll see lots of people will talk about how Niccolo Machiavelli talked about mercenaries being pretty useless and unreliable in his treatise, The Prince, back in the Middle Ages, or Enlightenment, I should say. Renaissance. Sorry, get my historical periods correct. And so mercenaries have been around for a very, very long time. And but what we've seen in the early part of the 21st century is that they have shifted away from what they look like in the latter part of the 20th century. So we're seeing more of them, we're seeing them being deployed in more armed conflicts, we're seeing the nature of them, as I've already mentioned, being different in terms of who's becoming a mercenary. And this map that I have here doesn't even give you the whole picture. But the sort of darker blue on the map is the countries that are sending mercenaries, that are being involved in recruitment of mercenaries and are using them in proxy wars in multiple different armed conflicts. The lighter, the mid blue is really sort of highlighting where people are being recruited from in order to become mercenaries. So you can see that, that's all multiple different continents. And then the lightest blue on the map is where they are being used, where they're being hired, usually by states, to hold on to power or to in some cases to take power. So it has become a global problem. I think for a long time it was perceived as very much a problem for the African continent, but it has become much bigger than that in the last few years. And that's partly to do with, you're probably all familiar with the infamous Wagner Group, which has been in it and its related organizations like Redoute and Rusic, which emerged out of the conflict in Syria. There were two particular groups, the Moran Group and the Slavonic Corps, that led to the creation of the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group has been associated with gross human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity in multiple countries. So Syria, Libya, Mali, Central African Republic, just to name a few. And of course, obviously in Ukraine most recently. And the Wagner Group is very interesting. Sarah mentioned at the beginning that I was a member of the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries. And the very first allegation letter that the Working Group was asked to deal with after I joined related to the murder of 3 Russian journalists in Central African Republic by the Wagner Group. And that was back in 2018. And the Working Group kept sounding the alarm about the Wagner Group. We did an allegation letter in 2018 in relation to Central African Republic, in relation to Libya in 2020, in relation to Central African Republic in 2021, in relation to Mali, in relation to Syria, in relation to Ukraine. And it really wasn't until Wagner was being deployed in Ukraine that everyone started paying attention, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about the Wagner Group. It was very frustrating that nobody had actually been paying attention to us and some fantastic investigative journalists who'd been doing work on Wagner, and 3 Russian journalists who lost their lives as a result of it. Now, Russia, in response to the various allegation letters that the Working Group sent, well, first of all, they attacked the process. That we as the Working Group, we were not acting in accordance with the code of conduct. That there was no information. This was all lies, etc., etc. And in any event, the Wagner Group didn't exist. That there was no such thing as the Wagner Group, and that Russia did not use mercenaries, and that mercenarism and the use of private military security companies was unlawful under the Russian criminal code. And you can go and look at the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries, look at the communications, the letters, and you can see the replies from Russia that consistently say this. And I think it was December 2023 when actually, 22, when Wagner Group was finally registered as a management consultancy in St. Petersburg. And that was the extent that Wagner existed. But it's important to recognize 2 things. One, that Russia is not the only country that is using mercenaries to participate in proxy wars and to avoid accountability for that. Other countries are doing it. Countries like Turkey, countries like UAE, Azerbaijan, for example, they are using mercenary actors as well. And the second thing is that essentially Russia provided the model for how to do it. and established by establishing geopolitical ties with countries that are very rich in natural resources, have fragile political systems, fragile democracies in some cases, and then offered these proxy actors as the solution to the security problems that these countries are facing, in return for access to the natural resources, gold, diamonds, timber, oil, you name it. All natural resources are open for exploitation here. So why should we care about the use of mercenaries in multiple conflicts? I remember being in a webinar. It was a Nigerian organization that had set it up, and there were Nigerians saying, well, if our own military can't deal with the security issues presented by armed groups and paramilitary organizations, then why shouldn't we hire foreigners to come in and carry out these activities, these security activities? Well, the list there tells you why. When you're dealing with these kinds of actors, they're not the same as the regular armed forces. Now, it's important to recognize that, of course, regular armed forces commit war crimes, they commit human rights violations. We know that. But the difference is that when you have regular armed forces, public security forces, usually you have some system of control. And you have military codes of criminal justice, you have courts martial, you have routes to accountability to hold people to account, and you can identify them. Yes, military personnel are identifiable. You can identify which battalion they're attached to. They have a number. They're very easy it's very easy to figure out who somebody. It's not easy, but it's possible. When you have mercenary type actors, it's almost impossible to identify them. They deliberately operate under the radar and in the shadows, and you don't know what training they've had. You don't know what the system of control is, who's in charge, all of those things. And what we've been seeing in recent years is that they also have been introducing more powerful weapons particularly into non-international armed conflicts, and that's had devastating consequences for civilian populations. And we've seen civilian populations being indiscriminately targeted by these actors to the extent that it would rise to the level of crimes against humanity and war crimes. So what they are doing is they are not doing what they promised to do. They are not resolving the security problems that these countries have. In fact, they're making them worse because they are targeting the civilian populations. In many countries, it's the Muslim population who are being inextricably linked with Muslim or Islamic terrorist organizations or Islamic paramilitary organizations. And so we've seen this. We've seen, in Mura in Mali, for example, it was an entire community that was targeted. And what we see happening is that these civilian populations, they're on the receiving end of violence from multiple actors. So they're on the receiving end of violence from these mercenary groups, but they're also on the receiving end of violence from the Islamic non-state armed groups as well as the state military, as well as public security forces. And so these communities are under siege from multiple different actors, and they undermine peace processes. They're very difficult to. The essence of a mercenary is that you're a foreigner. They go in and then they leave. Yes, and so all of the ways of thinking about peace processes and the way of thinking about how do we sit down and negotiate a peace How can you do that with somebody who's left or somebody whose motivation is financial or geopolitical, which is often the case with these proxy actors? So it's very, very difficult to negotiate a peace in those kinds of circumstances. So we already talked about the spectrum of actors, so I'm just going to move on from that because we're talking about the ones on the far right. And there has long been a debate about the definition of mercenary, and it's a really, really problematic definition because we have, as we will see, in the Geneva Conventions, Additional Protocol 1, the definition of a mercenary. And all that it does is define a mercenary for the purposes of determining whether somebody automatically receives prisoner of war status or not. If you are a mercenary, you're not a combatant, and you do not automatically receive prisoner of war status. It does not criminalize mercenarism. Yeah? And the definition is convoluted and complicated and cumulative. There are 6 elements to it, and you have to meet all 6 elements in order to be defined as a mercenary. A little bit even more complicated than that. The first 3, you have to be able to show that you were recruited as a mercenary, that you participated in the hostilities, and that you were motivated by private gain. All completely subjective. Remember what I was saying about these are actors that operate in the shadows? How do you prove what somebody's motivation was? How do you prove that they actually participated in the hostilities? How do you prove how they were recruited? Very, very difficult. And the further 3 final 3 elements are also very problematic because if you're a national of a party to the conflict or a resident of the territory where the armed conflict is taking place, you're not a mercenary. Yeah? So if you ask me, are there mercenaries participating in the Ukraine conflict? The answer is yes and no, and I also need to see their passport. Yeah? So if you're a Russian national or you are a Ukrainian national and you're fighting for the Wagner group, and it's important to understand that with Wagner, the second Russians have historically been the main recruits of Wagner, but Ukrainians were the second group. So Ukrainians who supported Russia also for Wagner. And but if you have got nationals of other countries who are fighting in the Ukraine conflict, so from Kyrgyzstan, from Tanzania, we know that there are people from these countries who have been fighting for the Wagner group. They potentially would meet the international legal definition of mercenary. Yes, but in terms of the Geneva Convention, so what? Yeah, doesn't create a crime. Just says you're not a prisoner of war. That's it. If you're a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, you're also not a mercenary. And we see countries trying to circumvent that provision. UAE does that. UAE recruits foreigners and incorporates them into its armed forces, and then they've been deployed in Yemen, for example. And if you've been sent, and the last one is the one that really leaves things wide open for states to abuse. If you've been sent on official duty, then you're not a mercenary. So of course this would cover our friends in military police or who are police officers who are doing training.
Police,
but for example, but police or military police who'd been sent to carry out training would not be a mercenary. Neither would peacekeepers. Yes, or those who are doing training, military training. Yes, you're not a mercenary. Okay. The problem is, if you go back to when we were talking about Russia and Russia saying the Wagner group didn't exist, Russia's response to the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries was, we have sent trainers to train the military of Central African Republic. We have sent trainers to train the military of Mali. Now, that on the face of it, it's not a problem, except they were actually participating in the fighting. And that's not what a trainer does. Yeah? Trainers do not participate in the fighting. Yeah. So We do have two instruments that do create a crime or crimes. The crime of using, recruiting, financing, and training mercenaries. And we see that in the African Convention on Mercenarism. You can look at that for yourself. And also the International Convention on Mercenarism. So they do create crimes. And states are expected, state parties to those two instruments are expected to put in place domestic legislation creating the crimes of using, training, financing, and recruiting mercenaries. There are only 38 state parties to the International Convention on Mercenarism, and of the African Convention, it's only about between 2 and 3/5 of African Union states that are party to that convention. So there's not a lot of state buy-in on these instruments. There are, however, many states do have some form of criminalization of mercenarism at the national level, but it's very, very piecemeal and it's not consistent. Okay, so yeah, so definition is hugely challenging. Okay. So where does that leave us in terms of the use of mercenaries? I've already talked about some of these examples already. Libya is an interesting one because in Libya you have at least 2 different states participating on different sides in the Libyan conflict. You have Russia on General Haftar's side, and you have Turkey on the Libyan government's side. And they have recruited mercenaries, particularly from Syria, but also from other countries to participate in the conflict in Libya. And the presence of these mercenaries in the Libyan conflict have caused delays in general elections. They have caused delays in the peace process. It's been consistently said that they need to leave Libya for the peace process to move forward, and that has not yet happened. In Central African Republic is where the Wagner Group still exists. Wagner has, after the death of Mr. Prigozhin and Mr. Utkin and others, the Wagner Group was by and large integrated into the Russian Ministry of Defense. But with the exception of Central African Republic. So the rest of Wagner has become the not neo-Nazi title of the Africa Corps at all. It's not neo-Nazi in any way, shape or form. And the Wagner Group continues to exist in Central African Republic. And it is completely enmeshed with the government and security system, with the gendarmerie in Central African Republic, with customs. If you go, the UN working group, we received information that people were going to the local police station to complain about missing family members, for example. Family members who disappeared, and they would turn up at the police station, and Wagner operatives would be in the police station, and people were then being detained arbitrarily, were being tortured, and the Wagner Group personnel were part of that process. So Central African Republic is a very specific example. We're not seeing the same level of enmeshment in Mali or in Niger, for example, probably because there are now, as a result of the coups in those countries, we've got military governments in power in those countries, and they've been more able to resist this enmeshing of the Wagner Group or the Africa Corps into the country, and they've been able to keep it at a distance, still paying very heavily for the services though. So I mentioned Mali already. Sudan, there's not been so much attention focused on Sudan. probably because the number of mercenaries in Sudan on the Wagner side from Russia is quite small. They were there. Of course, Sudan is important because it has a big port. So it's been very strategically important in terms of getting weapons into well, firstly into Sudan and then into Central African Republic and Mali and elsewhere. In violation, of course, of the international sanctions regimes, which prohibit the weapons going into those countries. But Wagner's absolutely been in Sudan. And then we've got Yemen. Yemen is also one where there's not been a lot of attention paid, but there have been Sudanese and other nationalities, particularly from Latin America, Colombians in particular, who've been recruited by the UAE, as I mentioned, but also by Saudi Arabia. And as I said already, the UAE incorporates them into its armed forces, which gets around that definitional problem. If you're a member of the armed forces, you're not a mercenary. And then very recently, you may have been reading in the press just in the last few months that there have been Romanian mercenaries in the DRC. There are conflicting reports about this. They've probably been there for a couple of years. They are there. They've been hired by the DRC government. There are two companies involved. One is Romanian and one is Belgian, and or at least has a Belgian holding company. And you may have seen just a couple of months ago that approximately 200 to 300 of them surrendered to the Rwandans. The Rwandans are backing the M23 armed group in DRC, and yes, so here we have an EU country sending EU citizens to an armed conflict. They were very, very well armed. They were being paid several thousand US$ every month, in comparison to approximately $100 that the DRC soldiers were being paid. And they surrendered and asked the UN for help, and the UN had to get them out after they surrendered. It'd be interesting to see what happens to them next. Probably not very much. This is not clear who paid. Presumably the DRC government, and presumably in some form of natural resources.
It's also interesting to know how was the recruitment there.
This is something I was actually asking somebody about this today, because with Wagner, the recruitment process with Wagner, and I'll give you a couple of examples of Wagner. If you it was on Telegram, it was on social media, it was on the Russian Facebook. You could be recruited to Wagner. It's not clear. At least some of the Romanians came via the French Foreign Legion. They had French Foreign Legion backgrounds. And of course, the French Foreign Legion is integrated into the French military, so they're not mercenaries either, according to the international definition. But this is a very, very common pathway to mercenarism, is having been a member of the Foreign Legion or of any other military. Nagorno-Karabakh, you might not be so familiar with Nagorno-Karabakh. It's an international armed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan was using Turkish recruited Syrians in that conflict, recruited by a Turkish company, Sadat International. And then Ukraine, and talked a little bit about Ukraine already. And there have been allegations that Wagner in particular was involved in the commission of atrocities around Bakhmut, but also elsewhere in Ukraine. One of the interesting things about the Ukraine conflict is we've seen a weaponization of the term mercenary, particularly on the Russian side. The question I've asked there about the International Legion of Territorial Defence of Ukraine, integrated into the armed forces. So again, circumvention of the definition. Ukraine is interesting because it is a party to the International Convention on Mercenarism and has in fact criminalised mercenarism at the national level and has prosecuted some Wagnerites. Some going back to to 2014, some going back to Syria. Some of the trials have taken place in absentia, which of course is also problematic, but there are some things going. So how do states respond to the allegations that they are using mercenaries? Well, apologies, the first one is in French, but this is the Malian government's response to the UN Working Group's letter about the Mura massacre and other violations of human rights in IHL in Mali. And the Malian government is categorical. It does not use mercenaries or private security personnel. And it talks about how there has been this long history, or going back to the Soviet Union days, of Russia and USSR sending military trainers to Mali. And that is all that is going on. Nothing to see here. They're not fighting, they're not committing human rights violations or war crimes or crimes against humanity. Categorical. And I thought this other quote was from Romania was interesting. Because it's the same line.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same line. The Romania's foreign minister described them as private employees of the DR Congo government, that's who's employing them, on an army training mission. Yeah, they're not mercenaries, they're there on an army training mission, but it's not clear whose army they're representing and who sent them for training. So the training part is also hugely problematic when it comes to the definition of mercenary. Now here's some issues around recruitment, and again this is where it ties in with what Alex was talking about in terms of human trafficking. We've seen a big shift in the last few years in the way in which mercenaries are being recruited. We're seeing them being recruited in larger numbers than we've seen before. I mean, even the Romanians in DRC, that was quite a large group. 200-300 was actually quite large. If you go back to the 1970s, to mercenaries, very well known mercenary situation in Angola, you weren't talking about large numbers. If you go back to Sri Lanka in the 1980s, a British company called Kilimini was sending mercenaries to support the Sri Lankan government against the Tamil community and the Tamil Tigers. Again, not large numbers, but they were directly participating in the fighting. What we've been seeing in the last few years are significantly larger numbers being recruited. So we're seeing people being recruited from Syria. Now the photograph that's there is of Syrian nationals. Now there are two distinct categories of individuals being recruited from Syria. One is armed fighters, for the fighters who've been fighting in the Syrian armed conflict, different sides, but they've got experience of fighting. And then the other group is people who had no other socioeconomic choices. So you have communities who were in dire need because of the way they had been treated by the Syrian government. They had no employment, they had no means of taking care of their families, and so they were ripe for predatory recruitment. So we see both Russia and Turkey going into Syria and recruiting Syrian nationals. Now, some of them did so voluntarily. If you can say that, financial need was voluntarily, but others were coerced or put under duress to become mercenaries. Threats were made against their families. They were offered citizenship of Turkey, for example. There were lots of different mechanisms used, and the working group on the use of mercenaries, we wrote a report on recruitment, and in consultation with the special rapporteur, Siobhan, I've forgotten Siobhan's family name.
Yeah, she was a colleague in Perta.
Yes,
Malali.
Malali, thank you. Siobhan Malali is a special rapporteur on trafficking. We talked long into the night about this, and she said, well, if somebody has been coerced or put under duress, then essentially they're being trafficked for the purposes of mercenarism. And so we're seeing additional layers of victimization. And I was at an event once and I talked about this, that we're seeing mercenaries being the victims of human rights violations because they're being trafficked. And that's not how we think about mercenaries. We think about them being the perpetrators of violations, not being the victims. But you can, of course, you can have both. You can be both. So we've got this really problematic layer being added.
Yeah, totally. There's the same layer added to the double status, being perpetrator of human trafficking at the same time a trafficked person, and all the application of the non-punishment clause. I think we can really find very similarities.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. So this was just to show you how some of the recruitment techniques that get used. This is from Russian Facebook, in essence, and this is the winning hearts and minds, getting people on side. This is part of the geopolitical way to get people on side, handing out T-shirts, having statues of Wagner in Bangui and Central African Republic. So we're seeing recruitment. I'll very quickly just talk about financing and accountability. I already mentioned at the beginning that what we're seeing is we can see that there are very, very clear links between the financial channels used to pay mercenaries, to pay for weapons and materiel. It's exactly the same. It's the same as they're being used by terrorists, by human traffickers, by transnational organized crime, by pirates. It's the same, or at minimum there are deep overlaps. There's no question of that. And they are using traditional banking systems. They're using alternative banking systems. You can use cryptocurrency to purchase weapons. For example, the individual mercenaries get paid in cryptocurrencies, but then go to the bank to withdraw the cash. And the states that are acting as proxies in these armed conflicts are getting paid in diamonds, gold, timber, etc., etc. I already mentioned that. Finally, in terms of mercenaries being held to account, the reality is they're not. You can look at the slides. There are major obstacles to accountability for mercenaries. Already talked about how they're incredibly difficult to identify. That's the key aspect. You've also got other issues that, the Malian government, for example, refused to allow investigators to go in and gather evidence, or not even gather, is preserve evidence for future prosecutions. It wasn't possible. So all that evidence is just non-existent. And just to give you a sense of exactly how difficult it is. So we have one Wagnerite who was recruited from Kyrgyzstan. Well, he was recruited when he was in Moscow, actually, but he's a Kyrgyzstan national. Apparently during COVID, his business, he had a travel business that went bust, and he apparently was looking for something else to do. Of course, I'm going to be a mercenary. Why not? And he apparently fought in Ukraine. When he went back to Kyrgyzstan, he was prosecuted under the Criminal Code of Kyrgyzstan, and he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. That was appealed. That sentence and conviction was appealed. And it was overturned, and he was it was reduced to 2 years, and he was basically under house arrest. And he disappeared. And the next we hear of him is he's back in Russia, and he's apparently been given Russian nationality, and therefore can fight for Russia, for whoever. So you can see the sort of games that get played in terms of accountability. There are some other examples of successful cases, but they're very few and far between. There were attempts to try and bring prosecutions at the International Criminal Court, but that kind of came to a dead end because the cases were against Mr. Prigozhin, Mr. Utkin, and others who are no longer with us, and you can't prosecute somebody who's dead. So one of the things that I'm doing in my current research with the Mercury project is to say, okay, because I'm not an international criminal lawyer, I'm a human rights lawyer, let's look at human rights mechanisms. Can we use existing human rights mechanisms to hold states to account? Because international human rights law is all about state responsibility to protect human rights. But there's never been an example of a human rights mechanism hearing a case involving mercenaries. And there's a whole lot, there's a whole very large scope of exploration to be done there. And that essentially is what I and my team are working on at the moment. And I can talk to you more about Mercury if there are questions. I know that was a lot, but I did promise I would try and weave it all together, and I hope I've managed to do that in a reasonable way.
Because we started also 10 minutes late, so you're perfectly on time. If there are questions about your project, we can address them after the Magistris has delivered his speech. And would you be so kind to change the presentation? And then the floor is yours. Thank you, Sorcha, very much for this really comprehensive overview and for highlighting.
Sure.
We will shift gradually to the topic of the role. Okay, you already have the remote process.
Well, no bedtime stories from me tonight, maybe later. We start with some comments. You heard about crimes. Who does investigate crimes? Who carries out investigations? Please. These are the police. I heard about attacks of military and non-military nature, about the weaponization of mercenaries, but we are in a era of the weaponization of everything. Migration, human resources, environment. Think about a dam which may be blown up, or a nuclear plant which may be blown up. But then how everything started. I'm not going to middle age with the soldier of fortune, the captain of fortune, Capitani Ventura, you may remember for the Italians. But think about, you mentioned Iraq. The mighty military instrument of power was not capable to ensure for protection to its own compounds. So they privatized security. I bumped that into Chile. Private security contractors guarding our bases, the coalition of willing bases. Do you know that I just my memory is a little bit hazy, but I remember that 2/3 of the budget of the US was devoted for protection through these companies. How can we fill this void, the very void that you mentioned before? Is it possible that we have to give somebody else the task? Why is the mighty meter instrument of power can fill the void? Well, I could have rested my cases at the first comment of the Professor MacLeod. Vetting. Who does vetting? Who carries out vetting? It's not a task of the police, the law enforcement intelligence, maybe. And then financial flows. Who follows the money? The Falcone method, the great prosecutor killed by mafia. So is it a problem? Private military security company are a problem or a solution to the problem or a source? So do they care about allegation letters, Professor? Do they? Or an investigation properly carried out is more effective? I can quote slide number 6 by you, when you mention some of the challenges posed by them across the competition complete continuum. I'm talking about competition continuum, but we're talking in the media, we speak about all the phases of a war or in a destabilized environment. But as Professor said, the legal framework. Who imposes the legal framework? So let's go now to the heart of the presentation. I'm the Commandant of the CoESPU, the Commandant of a compound where there are 3 different institutions: CoESPU, Center of Excellence for Stability Policing Unit, European Gendarmerie Force, Permanent Headquarters, and NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence. All in all, the International Stability Policing Hub, which deal with the 5 main international organizations waging peace rather than war: European Union, NATO, African Union, the United Nations, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. 11 different countries dealing with the same subject matter from different perspectives. Yet, we're talking about the cops. Never mentioned by Professor MacLeod, not because she didn't want to do so, if I may, but because it's underrated, this instrument. It's forgotten. No one think about it. I can talk for hours about Afghanistan. The mandate didn't provide for anything. And the light footprint approach of the international community was a farce. We empower a government, which at the end of the day, vaporish in 11 days. Colonel Brewer, my deputy, will say 9 days because there is a dispute. Why? I will rest my case later because otherwise I discover all my cards and I don't want to be called guards. You know that I like training in boxing. Also do some boxing along with my deputy. So this is what we find when we deploy after a tsunami, after a war, after bombings. Havoc. We need a strong government, so a strong instrument to enforce the rule of law, which is comprised by the 3 C: cops, courts, and corrections. But in this havoc, in this entropy, too many people, too many actors play a role. And also non-state actors. Do they have competitors? Well, there is a cycle. The conflict, organized crime, where the war crime overlap, crime and war overlap. Lays. And the mercenaries, yes, they facilitate trafficking, exacerbate insecurity, indeed. They hinge on human security, the very center of gravity of stability policing. The cops care about the population. Human security, I'm talking about, let's say, the NATO perspective more than the UN perspective. Children are conflict, sexual, gender-based violence mentioned by Professor MacLeod as well. Trafficking human beings. Building integrity. We must teach them how to abide by laws. These is crucial to create legitimate institutions. Don't forget it. To win the battle of narratives at the end of the war, to leave behind the long-term peace and stability. Otherwise, private security company will flourish, and as well as corruption and bribery. Protection of civilians. Who does protect the civilians? It's not the military, it's not the police, or do we have to rely on these private military security companies? So, instability. Okay. So, the cops can contribute to making the difference. So, what is stability policing? I cannot tell you that there are several definitions. There is only one agreed definition, which is in NATO, which is currently not my primary counterpart, but we have only one definition. It is aimed at either replacing or reinforcing indigenous police when they are not capable to fill that void, this very void, the policing gap. I will be there in a second. To uphold human rights. How many times Professor MacLeod mentioned human rights? The police can do it. They do it at home and overseas. They can do it if somebody calls them, if somebody dial 112 or 911. But if there is no legal framework, we cannot do anything. To ensure the rule of law and the protection of human rights, as I said. Public order and security is crucial as well. To ensure the so-called safe and secure environment, something which is also pivotal in ensuring freedom of movement to the military. In fact, stability policing can be conducted by the cops, the so-called carabinieri-like forces. I mean, police forces with military status expressing civil law enforcement capability. This is why I dare to stop you 1 second beforehand. Because yes, behind the police with military status, there's always a misunderstanding. Oh, these are also military police. Yes, we can take care of the military. But something is the military, something is the compound where they're the military, something else is taking care. So the recipient changes of people, of their security, about the human security, as I mentioned before. So, as you see in this gap, we have two different lines. The dot line shows which is the target capacity of the police, the indigenous police. At the beginning, you see loneliness. And then below is the actual, the real capacity of the police. Is a huge void of skills, capacities, but also of needs of the local population which get unfilled. So if I do not fill this gap, think about your neighborhood. Somebody else will fill it. Can we afford it? This is not, maybe we should ask the politicians. So, these in a nutshell, I would say, are the capacities that a stability policing asset can bring about in a fragile state. It's very easy. Think about your police, your own country, and about what your police can do in your own country, and bring your police force with the same task overseas. The problem is that it's to be robust enough to face a very fragile environment. This is why the carabinieri-like forces, also gendarmerie-like forces, are crucial, because we are interoperable. Because, as somebody else, General Mike Jackson, the first commanding general of the NATO mission in Kosovo, said, the carabinieri are just soldiers with the mindset of cops. Something which is crucial. Intelligence gathering, I said before, but community engagement, build trust, legitimate institutions, win heart and mind of the local population. This helps also leaving behind long-term peace and stability when we depart. But how can you do it? Building trust through community-oriented policing. View of this map. Not the Italians, please. No, those who. You know, you don't confund it. There is a joke with pistachio, because you said the Americans say pistachio, whilst we say Pinocchio. It's a conundrum for me. Anyway, Who arrested Pinocchio? The Carabinieri, thank you so much. Why Mr. Collodi, the very famous writer, choose the Carabinieri and not other police forces? In Italy, there are multiple police forces. Because, as somebody says, I'm not from Sardinia, but I love Sardinia. I served there and I've had so many reasons why I'm so close to Sardinia. I love it. Because behind the Carabinieri, there is a saying, and they called us, especially in Sardinia, the justice. How comes? I mentioned the 3C, cops, courts, and correction. The cops. So I'm not the courts. How comes? The epitome of justice, because they think about policing as something which is just. Another time I should say, I rest my case today. I like it. We are both Highlanders, so we are proud about it. Scottish, she's Scottish, I'm from Abruzzo. So. Both Highlanders. So, challenges, opportunities, the legal framework. Indeed, it is indeed a great challenge. If a stability policing asset, when deployed, doesn't have a legal framework which allows for investigation, unfortunately, we are powerless. So we need. And unfortunately, there are too many jurisdictional ambiguities. You are very right, madam. So I cannot say more how much I concur with. How much they are complex, boxes within boxes. How can you find the CEO of one of security company unless he's got stricken by somebody else? And then cultural silence. How many Italians are we? Are here? Thank you. Omertà, no? Omertà is a very infamous word in Italy about the cultural silence imposed by mafiosi. We must break, and we do indeed break the culture of silence in Italy. It's challenging, but we do so with the support of the local authorities, local communities, and also police forces. But this applies also in fragile states. They don't call it mafia. It's still organized crime. Also, more transnational organized crime. As you mentioned, madam, you are very right. And they exploit the void in the borders because there is no interagency cooperation over there, which is crucial. And private security companies flourish in this void. Think about also the border. I give the example of, you mentioned Mali, for instance, in Africa, the Sahel area. So we brag about being an essential piece of a larger puzzle. But it's not just bragging about it. We are convinced that we can contribute to making the difference. You see all these actors. Community policing is not an actor, it's a function which can be implemented by several actors, mainly the gendarmerie, the carabinieri-like forces. But it's crucial because they are fully interoperable, these actors, with the military and with the civilian. So they have the capacity to bring together two different worlds. And they are capable to establish joint task forces, for instance. I mentioned before interagency cooperation, and also integrate civil society with the international organization. So, apart from the NATO definition, let me underline something. I'm drawing to a conclusion. 3D policing assets do protect state vulnerabilities below the threshold, also below the threshold of war. Again, think about the police. We do not utilize always lethal force. So by doing so, we minimize collateral damage. And it's a way to say, always in NATO, intermediate force capability, stability policing assets operate in between the mere presence and the use of lethal force. This helps winning the battle narratives that I mentioned before. And we support the military mission, the green mission, which approaches everything from a green perspective, I would say, the military perspective, also with the blue perspective, the law enforcement perspective, which is far different, thanks to the Pinocchio approach. Pinocchio approach, I mean community-oriented policing. And policing ways, means, and ends do foster legitimacy, but also resilience, the capacity of any country to react to a shock. If you have the first line of defense, which is law enforcement, capable to do so. But for me, in all the great case arrested by Professor MacLeod, I was fascinated by your presentation. I'm not flattering you. There's a piece missing. Why don't we hinge on policing, on law enforcement? If you forget if you forget to call 911 in Italy 112, don't make a mistake, please. Otherwise, nobody will show up. You lose the opportunity. But it's not me. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, a US auditing body of the Congress, said so about Afghanistan, policing in conflict. The Chilcot report in Iraq is familiar for the brief. It's the inquiry of the US, the British government on the campaign in Iraq. They both agreed that they should have called the police before putting the boots on the ground, to fill those voids that somebody else will have filled. Private security companies, local organized crime, transnational organized crime, you name it. And so, policing upholds human rights, human security. I already mentioned the cross-cutting topic of human security. Just to remind you, protection of civilians, children in conflict, sexual gender-based violence, trafficking human beings, cultural property protection, which, if we fail to protect cultural property, ladies and gentlemen, we may allow genocide, because the first step of genocide is committed by destructing, the destruction of cultural property. Think about Rwanda. They started by desecrating cemeteries. Do I have to recall somewhere else where they started by changing the names of the streets or looting the museums and then changing the artifacts or changing the status? Think for Italy, I always think about Colosseum. If they touch my Colosseum, they will wipe away part of my history. This is ethnic cleansing in my book. It should be the same. I mean, I quoted Rwanda, so everybody should be horrified. And from the military perspective, in Africa, it's very true. I can talk about it. We spoke about it. Several examples. It helps to relieve some stress from the military and to consolidate the battlefield gains, because the military will proceed ahead, fighting ahead, and will have the police, the stability policing asset, the Carabinieri-like forces holding the fort on the back. Fully interoperable. How can we support through CoESPU? You are more than welcome. I'm really looking forward to hosting you. We are celebrating this year. We have been celebrating the 20th anniversary. June 26th is our diamond event. The slide is self-explanatory. And I will leave you just with a small piece of advice. What's out of me? Because one of my ancestors was a captain of fortune. So my ancestor, going back to the story, my family, I had some mercenary in my family. It was the Middle Age.
Thank you very much, General Magistris. I know, Sorcha, that you would like to maybe react with a word or two on what he said. I have one Commandant question, and then I would give 5 minutes to the floor. I would give the floor to you guys here and also online. Those online, you can post anything in the chat. If we don't manage to answer it now, we will collect the questions that will be posted online and send them to the speakers, and we'll be able to answer after the event. But yeah, one word to you, and then questions from the top. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will put that date in my diary. I will be happy to come back to Italy in June. A little hot for my Scottish genes, but I'll survive. I think you make a really good point about the policing being absent from the conversation. But I think I think you're also talking about some of the actors at the other end of the spectrum that I mentioned. But there's an ongoing UN intergovernmental working group that has been going on for years and years and years. I'm hoping that it will create some sort of instrument before I retire. I'm not entirely hopeful, but it is trying to put in place an instrument that will regulate private military security companies to try and fill the void. And I've got to look at we're meeting in Geneva and not this week, next week. And I'm trying to think, is policing mentioned anywhere in that draft instrument? So you've got me thinking about that. But I know that in some countries, the police are involved in the regulation of the private security sector. I've been doing a lot of work on sort of West Africa in the last couple of years, and I was just looking back at how some countries license private security companies. In Angola, for example, it is actually the police that issue the permits for the private security sector, and a lot of countries do they do criminal checks, etc. So the police are increasingly being involved in the regulation of the private security sector, the ones that are providing security for people and assets, not the ones that are doing the fighting, because you don't regulate them, you want to prohibit them, and that's a slightly different thing. But you've absolutely given me something to think about, so thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we also can discuss this a little bit later, but also at on the 22nd of June and before. I mean, we can definitely continue discussions. One of the thoughts that I had was stability policing as an essential piece of the puzzle, as you said, Generale, and then also the role in post-conflict. And I was again thinking perhaps about the peace deal concerning Ukraine and of course the part of it is a possible exploitation of natural resources. Also, again, there would be use and definitely deployment of as many on private companies, private security companies. So again, questions of how these two actors will actually work together in preventing possible human rights violations, depletion, etc. I think this would also be very interesting to look at in the future. Are there any questions from the floor? Alexandra, do you have the mic? Yes, you do. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. Really enjoyed hearing your presentation. I wanted to ask a question around culpability at the state level. I think I largely understand why a state might be motivated to use these paramilitary mercenary forces. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about your opinion. How does that compare when engaging with proxy forces? So, for example, if I want to engage a paramilitary group like Wagner, how does my culpability as a state level actor compare to my culpability as a state level actor using a proxy force like the Houthis or something to that effect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How would you like to address the question?
So that's for Dr. MacLeod.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe a couple more questions.
You also had a question?
Yeah.
Please. And there is one more question, and then we will answer.
Thank you so much for being here. This was really interesting conversation to listen to. My question is for everyone, but I think MacLeod, Dr. MacLeod mentioned this about the role of international courts and tribunals. I was specifically interested in if this could maybe change in the future to, for example, amend something like the Rome Statute, which is the legal framework for the International Criminal Court, to include mercenaries in there. How would that look like? Or is this something that we would never see changing or actually happening in the real world. I'm curious about that and the role that international courts would play in trying to address this issue.
Thank you. One more question?
Hi, thanks very much for the very interesting talks. I'm an associate fellow here for a few months. I'm normally at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. I'm Grant Dawson. I was just wondering, a question for Dr. MacLeod also. A lot of the thrust of your remarks were about mercenaries being a harmful thing that we should discourage and limit as much as we can. But isn't there also a political practice on the parts of some states for encouraging mercenary behavior? I was thinking, for example, of the Spanish Civil War, the international brigades that went to Spain, and there seems to be a repetition of that with respect to Western fighters flowing to support the international brigades in Ukraine, fighting for Ukraine against Russia. And so that seems to be a political practice that's in parallel to the legal efforts to contain mercenaryism. And I was wondering if that's also significant here. Do you agree that that's a practice that's relevant?
Thank you.
Culpability at state level. Then you're getting into state responsibility for internationally wrongful acts. I think there have I have colleagues, Candice Rondo and Ben Dalton at Future Frontlines in the US, and they have done astonishing work on establishing the links, the direct links between the Wagner Group and the Russian government. And on that basis alone, on the basis of the work that they've done that I've seen, I would suggest that Russia was essentially, running the Wagner Group, but at the same time, as I said to you, denying that its existence. The whole point of it was that they wanted to have plausible deniability to avoid state responsibility. So yes, I think as far as I'm concerned, yes, there has been involvement in war crimes. There's been involvement in crimes against humanity, and involvement in both international and non-international armed conflicts. This is one of the reasons why the Mercury project that I'm working on, which is a European Research Council project that we started about 6 months ago. It's a 5-year project, and it's why we're looking at the human rights mechanisms, because when you bring criminal prosecutions, you're bringing it against individuals. You're not bringing it against states. And the human rights approach would allow for a different kind of accountability. It's not going to change anything. I mean, the ideal is to prevent violations before they happen. Accountability, is essentially a failure of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. You're trying to deal with it after the atrocities have occurred. Which is why I come back to the third question and say this is why the anti-mercenary norm should be enshrined in and adopted by all, national law by all states. So to me it's clear, but I can't see anyone bringing a claim to the International Court of Justice on this. I might be wrong. It might happen, but I think the evidence is clear, and I think, as I say, I think human rights approach would get that level of state responsibility. Can't read my own writing now. In terms of international courts and tribunals, So I'm not an international criminal lawyer, and I think Alex is more your expert on this. But in terms of it ties into what I just said, in terms of amending the Rome Statute, what would you want to amend the Rome Statute to include? Because if you want to prosecute individual mercenaries or leaders of mercenary groups, then the Rome Statute would fit there. It wouldn't be necessary. Because we know that individuals can the jurisprudence tells us that individuals can be prosecuted for war crimes, so it wouldn't be necessary. But you're still going to have the incredible difficulty of proving, substantiating it. It's even more difficult than with other individuals. In terms of the third, I don't know if you wanted to say anything on that.
No, I totally agree. This was exactly going to be my point. This
Good.
the proving of would be the most complex stuff to me.
Yeah, and then in terms of the history of using mercenaries, there's a really great book, it's a few years old now, by Sarah Percy on the anti-mercenary norm, which I think everyone should read. It was her PhD thesis. It's a great book, and she talks about this from an international affairs perspective, or not a legal. I come at this from as a lawyer, human rights lawyer. But I think, states are very ambivalent about the anti-mercenary norm, and I think you see that in what I mentioned, about there being only 38 state parties to the International Convention on Mercenarism, only 30 something. I can't remember the exact number for the African Convention on Mercenarism, and states being very reluctant to become parties, and even some that have become parties put in place multiple reservations to the convention. Belgium has a reservation in relation to extradition of its nationals for the purposes of mercenarism to another country. So states are very interested in making sure their nationals are protected. They are not particularly keen to put in place to become party to the existing instruments. They are not keen to create a binding instrument on private military and security companies. And what's been interesting in the last couple of years is that the attention on the Wagner Group and the way in which it was circumventing all the existing mechanisms. States have focused a bit more attention on it. But yeah, it's I think I always say it's a bit like with terrorism. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's the famous saying. And I think it's, well, no, our people are private security contractors, your people are mercenaries. Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that going on, and I'm using very specific definitions here of mercenary, which is about you're directly participating in the hostilities, and I'm using a very clumsy definition of that in terms of saying they're fighting, because there is tremendous disagreement over what does it actually mean to say you're directly participating in hostilities. So the general was talking about in Iraq and Afghanistan, that there were police in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were private security contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. Were they directly participating in the hostilities because they were providing some sort of security for people and assets? Some would say yes, because the conflict would not have been possible without them. Others would say no, because they were not engaged in offensive activities. So where does that leave us? States are not big on the anti-mercenary norm, or they are when it's other people who are using mercenaries. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
From the human rights perspective, you could say, from the human rights perspective, you could say, in some senses, it doesn't matter if you're a mercenary or not. If you've committed a war crime, you've committed a war crime, So your status is irrelevant. However, if you're unable to prove that somebody has committed a war crime, then having domestic legislation that criminalizes the act of being a mercenary, so like the Kyrgyzstan example, then at least you can bring somebody, you can hold them to account. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
complicated.
Thank you very much. Yes, we realize that there are so many nuances and specific event definitions are not clear, and also at this hour of the day, and you were here, throughout. Thank you so much. It really has been also your first day after the spring break. I hope that you have enjoyed your comeback. Anyway, I would love to thank Dr. Sorcha MacLeod for having the time to fly here with many interconnections, and also General de Magistris. I really appreciate that he has been able to join. I hope that you have been able to appreciate, both keynote speakers' contribution and the way also that their topics touch and are synergical. And I also invite you to reach out also in the future. We will share the presentations in the PDF format if you're interested, and if you're interested also to reach out or maybe apply for an internship at CoESPU, you're very welcome. I wish you a pleasant evening. Have a good night, and thank you all that have connected online as well for your time. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.